As far as I know, you do not currently have official negotiation authority since October 7, but are you still in contact with both sides in the process? And is it possible to reach a long-term agreement? And is there still a hope in that direction? Because I think you're saying that there is a more responsibility of the state of Israel to bring the hostages home, and time is running out. Is time is really running out?
So I think that that there's no chance of a long time understanding between Israel and Hamas. I think that Hamas, by what it did, made itself not worthy of leading the Palestinian people or being a partner to the state of Israel in any kind of understanding. I accept the Israeli ultimate goal of removing Hamas's ability to govern Gaza and to threaten Israel. I also think that Hamas is responsible for bringing the Palestinian cause back 75 years. I think what's happening, they bear a great deal of responsibility for. They have been ruling for 17 years and managed to build hundreds of kilometers of tunnels for their own fighters and their own people, and not one single public shelter for their public. I think that the Hamas movement has created war crimes against its own people. And I hope the day comes when the Palestinian people are wise enough to stand up and blame not only Israel, but Hamas for what's happened to them. Just has been done in other wars around the world in history, when people finally understood that it was their leaders and their own people who created the disasters that led to where they got to. So that's one thing. With regard to the hostages, there is only one way to secure the release of all the hostages alive, and that's through an agreement with Hamas. The price, apparently, for that agreement is the release of all Palestinian prisoners in Israel. That's somewhere around 6,000 people, according to the latest data. It includes 559 people who are serving life sentences for murdering Israelis, some of them serving multiple life sentences for killing many Israelis. It includes 130 of the terrorists who crossed the border on October 7th and murdered Israelis and were not killed, but were captured by Israel. It also includes a lot of people who are only 20 to 30% of all the 6,000 prisoners are Hamas people, a very small number of Islamic Jihad people. Almost all of the people are from the West Bank. There are only about 300 of the 6,000 who are from Gaza. Many of them are serving on smaller offenses like belonging to a terrorist organization or throwing stones at soldiers, throwing Molotov cocktails at army vehicles. Not all of them are murderers, and not all of them can be defined as terrorists. And the big question is, if this deal is in the making, is Hamas willing to release all the hostages at one time in exchange for a release of all the prisoners at one time? The second question is, where should the prisoners be released to? There are Israelis who say, if we release them to the West Bank, this is a danger to all of us here in Israel and settlers in the West Bank. If they're released to Gaza, maybe Israel is free to go after them and kill them afterwards. I don't know. So I think in any event, I'm not sure how much is this is being considered by the Israeli government. I'm not sure if Hamas is seriously considering this proposal. If it is on the table, it is a huge dilemma for the Israeli government to decide on. If it is not done, if there is no negotiated release of the hostages, then to a certain extent, Israel is saying that the hostages will be sacrificed because they're being held in tunnels. They will be between Israeli commandos and Hamas combatants. And any way that the Israelis want to get the Hamas people out of the tunnels will endanger the lives of the hostages. We can't expect that there will be some heroic rescue operations.
Can we say that what makes today hostage crisis different from the others is that it's happening during a full-scale war and there are civilian hostages?
I don't think there's a precedent in modern history for 250, 240 civilians being held as hostages, including babies and children and women of all ages, and elderly people and sick people and wounded people. And they even took as hostages Thai workers. And in their attack across the Israeli border, they killed 10 Nepali caretakers. I mean, what part of the conflict are they on, the Nepali caretakers or Filipina caretakers who were killed by Hamas terrorists, and a group of Thai workers taken into Gaza? I mean, what's going on here? What do the Thai workers have to do with this conflict?
In an article you wrote for the New York Times, you said Israel, Qatar, and Hamas should engage in direct talks, no one else. Are you suggesting that the United States or any other actor should not intervene in this process?
I think that the best negotiations that take place in any conflict situation are when the enemies negotiate directly together. You know, it's clear that Israel won't talk to Hamas and Hamas won't talk to Israel. So we need third-party intermediaries. There are two primary parties concerned, Qatar and Egypt. The United States is there to put pressure on Qatar. They have leverage on Qatar. I don't think they're using all the leverage that they have, and I think that they should. Qatar tries, they put out a statement yesterday, the Qatari government, explaining that they are not a state that supports Hamas and supports terrorism. I would beg to differ. I think that Qatar is a state that supports terrorism. I think that hosting Hamas all these years is a form of supporting terrorism. Funding Hamas with more than $1 billion over the years is supporting terrorism. I personally believe that Egypt could negotiate better than Qatar with Hamas, but apparently both the Israelis and the Americans are putting most of their weight on Qatar to make this negotiation.
If Turkey had maintained its balanced policy after the Gaza war, could it have played a mediating, negotiating role regarding captives despite?
In the first week of the war, when I was asked, I talked about 3 states that could potentially mediate. It was Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. Turkey also is in an interesting position because Turkey is hosting hundreds of Hamas families. Yeah. And that's also leverage that could have been used on Hamas if Turkey wanted to, and the president of Turkey decided to firmly take sides against Israel and declared that Hamas is not a terrorist movement and made himself irrelevant in terms of a mediating role in this conflict.
How does the Israeli public, you mentioned about, but if you can give more details, how does the Israeli public view the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for hostages, in addition to the families' grief, sorrow? We can observe a certain level of anger through the press of Israel. How do you interpret the current situation?
Look, we don't have accurate surveys right now of Israeli public opinion. So what I'm saying is my impression, not based on data. It's just my impression. Mm-hmm. And my impression is that there are very, very strong opinions on both sides of the argument. There are Israelis with very, very strong opinions against giving in to Hamas at all and releasing even a single Palestinian prisoner. And there are people on the other side of the argument who are very, very strong and very vocal that the first thing that Israel has to do is bring back all the hostages, regardless of what the price is. There are very few people who are in the middle of this argument. They're either very strongly saying, make the deal now, bring home the hostages, even if we have to release all the prisoners. And there are people who are very strong in saying we shouldn't release even one single prisoner.
If Israeli government gives you any duty about, any responsibility about this hostage crisis, are you going to accept this?
If they were to ask me to do something, I would, of course, I would accept it. But they won't ask me.